Hello and welcome to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed. And as always, I'm joined by my regular guest, Mouin Rabbani, to unpack the biggest stories from the past week on Palestine and the Middle East and the wider region. Mouin, thank you for joining us again.
Thank you for having me, Nassim. It's always a pleasure.
Likewise, so I want to begin this week with the latest report by the UN Human Rights Council Human Rights Council documenting Israel's use of sexual violence. We'll begin with that, then discuss US holding talks with a number of East African countries on moving Palestinians from Gaza, ethnically cleansing Palestinians from Gaza to some of the East African countries. We'll discuss the hostage negotiations, latest assault on Yemen, strikes on Yemen, and then we'll discuss some of the other issues to do with freedom of speech, in particular related to Mahmoud Khalil. But I want to begin, as I said, with the report by the UN Human Rights Council documenting Israel's use of sexual violence and carrying out genocidal acts. I have a whole list of things which I wanted to cite, but I just want to get your thoughts on the report. It really is quite damning and disturbing, and I think it's one of the most damning reports that I have seen the UN Human Rights Council produce related to Israel in recent years.
Yes, this is a commission composed of three prominent individuals from South Africa, India, and Australia who have an ongoing mandate to monitor and report on the situation of human rights, not only in the occupied territories, but also in Israel itself. And they've produced a number of reports. And on this occasion, they produced one on sexual and gender-based violence, and it makes for shocking reading from beginning to end. And the report, of course, is freely available online. And the conclusions they've reached is that the various categories of sexual violence and gender-based violence that they catalog, which range from soldiers routinely exposing their genitals to schoolgirls at checkpoints in Hebron, to the systematic destruction of reproductive healthcare facilities in the Gaza Strip during Israel's genocidal military campaign. The conclusion that they've reached is that these activities, these patterns of violence by Israel and its military are systematic, intentional, and on the whole amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. But in the specific cases of the systematic, intentional destruction of reproductive healthcare facilities in the Gaza Strip also rise to the level of genocide, because in the words of the commission, they quite clearly are intended to prevent births in the Gaza Strip. And of course, creating conditions to prevent births is one of the 5 criteria for genocide under both the 1948 Genocide Convention and under the Rome Statute. It's, again, for people who think that the issue here is a few bad apples or a few unconscionable acts, what's so remarkable about this report is that it demonstrates that these acts are systematic, that they're intentional, and in many cases, as the commission members themselves state, are in fact intensifying.
And if I can just read out some of the crimes that have been documented. So it goes on to say, for example, that it has documented systematic use of sexual and gender-based violence. Israeli security forces and settlers committed rape, sexual violence, and public shaming against Palestinian women and men. Sexual violence was used as a tool of war during arrest. reproductive violence and attacks on women's health. There's destruction of Gaza's largest fertility center, eliminating thousands of embryos and reproductive materials. Pregnant women were denied medical care, leading to some 300% increase in miscarriages in Gaza. And of course, it goes on to conclude that the crimes that were documented were genocidal in their nature, and it goes on to quote Israeli leaders who have expressed genocidal intent. So, as I said, when I read it, it was one of the most scathing report that I have seen this UN
Yes.
Commission produce.
And if I could,
go on.
Yeah, please go ahead.
No, carry on. Sorry.
Well, I just wanted to make one additional observation is that typically when we think of sexual or gender-based violence, we quite rightly consider this to be an offense directed at women and girls, and typically they bear the brunt of such violence and harassment. But another thing that was telling about this report is the very high proportion of such violence that is directed at men and boys, up to and including elements of individuals, medical professionals being raped to death, the routine collective humiliation of men and boys who are either detained and kidnapped by Israeli forces in the Gaza Strip or in the West Bank. So it's quite interesting, that Israel, in this respect, is an equal opportunity offender, that it really makes no distinction between males and females in conducting these horrific atrocities.
Let's turn our attention to the hostage negotiation. Hamas at one point over the week agreed to release a US-Israeli soldier following direct talks with Washington. There's been a lot of, I would say, misreporting or, I don't know, misquoting of things over the past week regarding this. But it seems to be that Hamas is trying to divide the US and Israel on this issue by suggesting that the Americans can take their citizens. And I suppose Trump and corner Trump in a way, because the idea of Trump or any American president rejecting a hostage deal that would see the release of an American hostage, it doesn't look good for an American president, especially one who claims to be America first. So here it seems to be Hamas is trying to, treat the American hostages in isolation from the Israeli hostages. And Rubio himself was pushed on that by a reporter. He was asked, if Hamas offers American hostages as part of a deal, separate deal, would you accept that? And Rubio basically sidestepped the entire question and resorted to calling names. Hamas is this, Hamas is that, but he did not really address the questioner himself, whether he would accept a deal where an American citizen is released instead as part of a package with all the other Israeli hostages. So instead, Hamas is probably trying to divide the Israelis and the Americans.
Well, let's put Rubio to the side for a moment, because although he's formally the Secretary of State, he doesn't have much of a role in foreign policy. He's more a neocon ornament in Trump's trophy cabinet. And for example, he hasn't been involved in any of these discussions and negotiations really, and his role seems to be limited to increasing domestic repression against pro-Palestinian forces in the United States, which we're going to discuss later. So the two key individuals in this issue are Steve Witkoff, who is the Trump administration's Middle East envoy and the lead person in charge of this entire file, and more recently, Adam Boehler, who is Bowler, I think his name is pronounced correctly, and he is apparently a friend of Trump's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, and his role is the U.S. hostage envoy. So he has a much more restricted mandate, which is limited to seeking the release of captives abroad who are U.S. citizens. Further than that, he doesn't appear to have much of a role in these negotiations. But what appears to have happened is that the Americans came to the conclusion that the Israelis were forming the main obstacle to the further implementation of an agreement that would result in not only the release of all captives held in the Gaza Strip, but specifically of living captives and corpses who hold dual U.S. citizenship. And on that basis, Bowler, with the consent of his superiors in Washington, held a direct meeting with Hamas. I believe it was with Khalil al-Hayya, presumably in the Qatari capital, Doha. And in the exchange, I don't think they reached a particular agreement, but the Americans put forward their main demand, which is a retrieval of American dual citizens dead or alive from the Gaza Strip. And the Hamas put forward its main demand is that any agreement has to include a irreversible pathway to an end to Israel's military campaign in the Gaza Strip and a full Israeli withdrawal from the Gaza Strip. And regarding your question, yes, I do think that Hamas felt that by subsequently putting forward a proposal that focused exclusively on those with U.S. dual citizenship, that it could perhaps drive a wedge of some sort between the United States and Israel. I think if they genuinely believe that, it's really an illusion to think that that Hamas could drive a wedge between the U.S. and Israel, even in the context of U.S. frustrations with Israeli conduct. But what subsequently happened is that, Bueller held his meetings. He came up with a proposal that he apparently communicated to Witkoff. The Israelis were neither consulted nor informed about these meetings, and they had a complete meltdown about it once they found out, and they started leaking reports of it to the press in the hope of scuttling these talks. There wasn't much to scuttle because the talks had already concluded, given Bowler's limited mandate, and they're now putting forward also reports that Bowler has in fact been fired by the Trump administration. What did happen is that Bowler withdrew his nomination because that would require Senate confirmation. And, it's easier to get confirmed by the Likud Party Congress than it is by the U.S. Congress when it comes to matters relating to Israel. But he will remain on this team, actively conducting his responsibilities, working directly for the Trump administration, which, as you know, doesn't really care about formalities. So it may well be that he has a superior who is confirmed by the Senate, but that Bowler will be doing the actual work. But to get back to the main issue, so Witkoff has put forward a different proposal, which Hamas appears not to be accepting, and Witkoff is now making very belligerent noises that, what Hamas proposed to Bowler is completely unacceptable, that if they essentially, don't do as they're told by Washington, there will be hell to pay, and all these kinds of threats that we've heard before. I think these also should be seen in the context of a number of press interviews Bowler gave, in which he made what, from Israel's perspective, are absolutely outrageous, unconscionable statements, such as making the point that the U.S. is not an agent of Israel, observing that his Hamas interlocutors don't have horns growing out of their heads, that they're people like anyone else, and in his view, actually pretty nice guys, absolutely outrageous stuff that no U.S. official should ever be allowed to think, let alone say in public. So I think part of this is also the Americans trying to mollify the Israelis. What happens next is a little unclear at this point. Will the Americans force the Israelis to accept a more comprehensive agreement whereby some version of what was discussed in this U.S.-Hamas dialogue gets accepted, and that the Americans are front-loaded in any exchange, and it goes paired with progress towards the second stage of the ceasefire, which includes a formal cessation of hostilities and full Israeli withdrawal, or will the Americans, basically frustrated with Hamas, allow Israel to continue escalating its military attacks in the Gaza Strip, as it has been doing in the past week, and also once again sealing the borders and not allowing anything in or out? So these are kind of unanswered questions at this point.
It was interesting. It was mainly, from what I recall, Israeli sources that were saying that Bula had been taken off. Well, he's been
Removed,
he had
yeah.
removed from his position, and as you mentioned, that wasn't the case. And also, Secretary of State Mark Rubio, he's the one who came out and said that Bula's negotiation with Hamas was one-off, and he's seems to be discounting the whole situation, even though, as you point out, he's not the one who is calling the shots when it comes to any kind of negotiation with Hamas. It is Bula, and whoever is going to replace him. So it's interesting that maybe it was wishful thinking on the side of the Israelis that he was removed from his position. But I think I want to re-emphasize the point I was making earlier. I mean, it does look really bad for an American president who, if given a chance to have American citizens released in a hostage deal, that he would not accept that deal because he wants to wait for a conclusive and comprehensive deal, which sees all of the Israeli hostages and the American hostages released at once. It just, many Americans who are now questioning whether Trump really is an America First president, is really negotiating in the best interest of American citizens who are held by Hamas. So many will be asking that question.
No, you're entirely correct. I mean, it's not a good look for President MAGA to pass up an opportunity to retrieve U.S. citizens, dead and alive, from the Gaza Strip. Alternatively, I think some people might argue it's also not a good look for this, America First, do as we say or else president to have to engage in significant compromises and concessions directly with Hamas in order to achieve that. It's difficult, I think, to confidently predict what's next. The only thing I will say is that I think Witkoff's recent belligerent statements may well reflect not so much the current U.S. position and U.S. policy as much as seeking to mollify a hysterical pro-Israeli constituency within the U.S. after Buller's statements to the press, and is kind of, let's say, rhetorical cover and camouflage for what may really be happening behind the scenes, which could very well be, as you suggest, progress towards an agreement that would result at least in the U.S.'s ability to retrieve its dead and captives from the Gaza Strip.
Let's discuss Trump's Riviera plan. We spoke last week about Arab countries coming to Gaza restoration plan. I think it was something like $53+ billion worth of money they were willing to put in to developing Gaza. Last week, Trump began by saying that nobody is expelling any Palestinians. He said that during a meeting with the Irish Prime Minister, I think. So it seems like he says whatever needs to be said depending on who is in front of him. So when Netanyahu came, he announced a plan to ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza. Now you have an Irish official who is more sympathetic to the Palestinians, and he seems to be saying, no, nobody said we're going to expel Palestinians. But at the same time, the US, as I said at the beginning, they are discussing with a number of East African countries to host forced displacements of Palestinians. So they're speaking to Sudan, Somalia, and Somaliland. I think Sudan and Somalia, as far as I know, they've outright rejected this idea. I assume the other countries would do the same. So on the one hand, he seems to be saying, no, we're not going to ethnic cleanse Palestinians. But on the other hand, the US is still negotiating and trying to find a way to transfer or ethnically cleanse Palestinians from Gaza to a third country.
Well, it's exactly like you said. It's difficult to take any particular statement that Trump makes seriously because it tends to reflect the needs of the moment, either the last person he spoke to or the person who's in the room with him. And so there's not much consistency in these statements. And therefore, I think we're much better off looking at what the United States actually does when there seems to be a contradiction with what Trump says at any particular moment. And in this case, we've seen reports, I can't quite recall if they were reported in the Israeli press, the US press, or both, which indicated that the US and Israel had been in contact with the authorities in Sudan and Somalia and the breakaway region of Somaliland about taking in Palestinians from the Gaza Strip. Now imagine, the rationale for forcibly expelling Palestinians from the Gaza Strip is the horrible conditions in Gaza, but somehow Sudan, where there's been a fierce ongoing conflict now for the better
the genocide.
2 years, and the genocide in Darfur, and famine and starvation and all the rest of it, that's somehow where these Palestinians should go. Well, the Sudanese authorities did confirm that they were contacted. They didn't say specifically by who, and said that they had categorically rejected any such proposals. The authorities in Somalia and in Somaliland, by contrast, denied that they had even been approached. So they're basically suggesting that this is some kind of propaganda scheme that doesn't exist in reality, and that they hadn't been approached. And I believe in Mogadishu, the Somali authorities also indicated that they would not cooperate if they were in fact approached.
And there seems to be a lot of wishful thinking on the side of the Americans.
the
I mean,
least.
there is an assumption that Palestine, yes, maybe 100, maybe a few thousand may agree to leave, but the idea that they would leave en masse, hundreds of thousands, that just seems like pie in the sky to me. I mean, there is no chance that Palestinians will, in large numbers, agree to leave the Gaza Strip. And so there's a lot of assumptions there, which I don't think permits any kind of resettlement of Palestinians.
Well, just to add to that, if all these Palestinians are so desperate to leave the Gaza Strip, as Trump and others have been suggesting, how come Israel is prohibiting Palestinians who have left the Gaza Strip from returning there? Why do you need to prohibit their return if they have no intention of returning? So it's quite clear. All the propaganda about there's 20 Arab states and 57 Muslim states and this and that, and you put aside all the propaganda, and it's entirely clear that Palestinians are very attached to their homeland, Palestine, and see their future there, and see the main obstacle to having a future in their homeland, Palestine, not Egyptian restrictions on their departure from the Gaza Strip, but rather Israel's occupation, Israel's apartheid, and for the past year and a half, Israel's genocidal campaign and increasingly ferocious military campaign in the West Bank as well.
Yeah, let's turn to Yemen. I mean, the president who described himself as a peacemaker. He wants to win the Nobel Prize for Peace. He is now the fifth, I think, US president, consecutive US president to bomb what is one of the poorest countries in the world. The latest attack has killed at least 53 people, injured some 100 more. And I mean, ostensibly, this is to make the Houthis stop attacking ships. But what's the main trigger for this round of attack? And do you see that, as some are saying, that this is part of a wider initiative to target Iran or start a war with Iran?
Well, it's a military campaign to make the Red Sea safe for Israeli shipping. And the background to this is, as we've discussed previously, that Israel has reimposed a full-scale siege of the Gaza Strip, preventing the entry of electricity, fuel, water, and all the rest of it. And in response to that, the Houthi authorities in Sana'a, who had suspended their attacks on shipping in the Arabian Sea and in the Red Sea in response to Israel's acceptance of the January agreement, which led to a suspension of hostilities. What happened is that the Houthis, formerly known as Ansar Allah, stated that if the blockade was not lifted within 4 days, that they would resume their attacks on Israeli shipping, and they were quite specific. Not American shipping, not international shipping, Israeli shipping. And what happened is that before that deadline expired, the U.S. Naval Task Force in the Red Sea and Arabian Sea launched a series of attacks on targets in Yemen. I mean, the first question that has to be asked is, so, if Israel is this military superpower, how come its dirty work is being done by the United States rather than it conducting these attacks itself? Secondly, rather than put pressure on Israel to lift its blockade and allow nutrition for infants and desalination or purification of water in the Gaza Strip and so on. United States thought it would be better, to launch all these bombing raids on Yemen and kill dozens of people. The Americans have claimed that they killed a number of Houthi leaders. That hasn't been confirmed, but quite clearly, I think, the purpose here is to make the Red Sea safe, not for American shipping, but for Israeli shipping. And in response, the Houthis have said that they now consider all American shipping, whether military or civilian, as legitimate targets as well. The Americans have said this was not a one-off, that this will be an indefinite campaign until the Houthis cease and desist. But as you mentioned, Yemen has been under attack since the Obama administration. It's now almost a decade, since 2015. And there is no indication either that the Houthis are going to capitulate or that the United States has the capacity to make them capitulate. And now both sides have vowed to escalate further. But in response to the other part of your question, once again, Rubio, who's trotted out every so often to make belligerent statements, but doesn't appear to be playing a significant role in foreign policy, as when he was in Congress, holds Iran responsible for everything that happens in both the Eastern and Western Hemisphere. And other American officials, I think Secretary of Defense Hesketh, have also stated that this was not only a direct attack on Yemen, but also a direct message to the Iranians. And this raises another question, which is that on the one hand, the Trump administration has indicated, or Trump personally at least, has indicated a real desire to enter into negotiations with Iran as an alternative to an eventual military clash, while at the same time has been making these threatening belligerent noises that make it more and more difficult for the Iranians to respond constructively. Where things stand now is that Trump has sent a letter to the Iranian supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, who the Iranians have now said that they are studying the letter and will respond. But I think, I suspect the Americans feel that these attacks in Yemen will intimidate the Iranians and make them more liable to respond constructively. Whereas the reality, I suspect, is that the Iranians will now prioritize demonstrating that they are not intimidated, particularly because their relationship with the Houthis is much less solid than, for example, it has been with various militias in Iraq or Hezbollah in Lebanon.
And again, there's another false assumption here that the Houthis are somehow not independent actors. They do decide for themselves
Yes.
what kind of foreign policy they adopt. And I was in a discussion just before our conversation with a Yemeni friend of mine, and there's many people in Yemen who are opposed to the Houthis. They don't like the Houthis. But on one things they will support the Houthis is on the issue of Gaza. So if the idea is that somehow the Americans can drive a wedge between the Yemenis and the Houthis, this is not the way to do it. He was saying, even the Sunnis, the large majority of Sunnis who are opposed to the Houthis in Yemen, on the issue of Gaza and the blockade of the Red Sea, Israeli ships and things like this, they're 100% behind it. And if anything, it emboldens the Houthis to continue because they know this is the way to bring the country together, unite the country against a genocidal foe. That's how they see it. And so it's very counterproductive.
Nothing diminishes domestic criticism and opposition like external attack.
That's right, yeah. Let's turn to another interesting story, I would say, from Syria, where last week some 60 Druze scholars were invited for a pilgrimage to Israel. And of course, we mustn't overlook the fact that this visit was arranged within the context of a really perilous situation for Syria. The current government has had to crack down on Assad loyalists from last week. There was horrific violence, which we spoke about last week. A number of Druze leaders from Syria, of course, condemned the current initiative, 60 Druze scholars visiting Israel at this current moment. And they're saying that they're basically exploiting the situation to drive a wedge between the Druze and Syrians. How significant is this move, and how do you see this within the context of what's happening in Syria at the moment?
Well, I think it's significant because Israel has put forward this idea that, not formally at the formal level, but it's all over the Israeli press and being discussed by Israeli commentators and analysts and so on, that Syria should essentially be partitioned into a Druze territory in the southwest, then a majority Sunni territory, an Alawite region, and the Kurdish region, kind of recreating the way that Syria was ruled by the French during the mandate after the First World War. And what the Israelis, they've already said that they view themselves as the protectors of Syria's Druze community against the Syrian government. They've said the same about the Kurds. Well, there's a slight complication here, which is that during the past week or two, Syria's new rulers have reached agreements with both the Kurds in northern Syria and now with the Druze in southern Syria about their integration into the new Syrian state structures and the inviolability of the territorial integrity of Syria and so on. And so what the Israelis have done is they have used the Druze religious occasion of Nabi Shu'aib to invite these 60 Druze notables. I'm not quite sure if they're scholars or clerics or a mixture of both, to enter Israel on this occasion. And as you said, they were widely denounced by both Syrian Druze in Syria and Syrian Druze in the illegally occupied and annexed Syrian Golan Heights. So I suspect this Israeli initiative is going to backfire, but it has to be seen, I think, in the broader context of Israel seeking to impose its hegemony on post-Assad Syria. We've discussed before how it has occupied a territory, further territory within Syria that's larger even than the Gaza Strip, including the strategic heights, effectively prohibited the Syrian military from deploying military forces on almost a third of its own territory. Territory south of Damascus is continuing its bombing campaign in Syria. And I think Israel is looking at Syria very much like it looked at Lebanon during the 70s and the 80s, and the way colonial powers have often approached this part of the world, which is to proclaim themselves the protectors of a particular religious or ethnic minority, and then to use that status in order to seek to seize control or dominance over an entire territory. And as in previous occasions, it appears that on the whole, Syria's Druze are having none of this. If they do have a main demand, it is not that Israel enter Syria further to protect them, but that Israel end its occupation of Syrian territory, including the Golan Heights, which was traditionally primarily populated by Syrian Druze, who were almost all expelled in 1967.
And we also saw over the weekend exchange of bombing between missiles between Syria and Lebanon, Hezbollah, within the border areas. So, what was what triggered this escalation in your view? I mean, do you also see that within? Again, last week we spoke about enemies of peace. There seems to be concerted effort to make sure that Syria does not reconstitute itself as a strong entity, country that is not divided, and we have many actors in the region, Israel being chief amongst which, trying or seeking to divide Syria. And if that is the case, it seems like Hezbollah is also seeking to divide Syria and make sure that there isn't a strong Syrian Sunni entity there. So how do you see the current escalation between Hezbollah and Syria, the bombing that took place over the weekend?
That I think is much more difficult to determine. I mean, what's striking here is that the main party that has been attacking Syria quite intensively has been basically imposing new conditions on Syrian sovereignty, and has been, as we've just discussed, seeking to fragment Syrian society, has been Israel. Yet the rulers in Damascus have gone out of their way to avoid any overt or even rhetorical confrontation with Israel, and have been very slow to make any statements opposing Israel's policies. By contrast, they have from the outset been very hostile towards both Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. What exactly, and of course, in recent weeks have been pursuing a very violent sectarian policy in the coastal regions, in which many Alawites, Syrian Alawites, were massacred. I mean, we're not just talking about remnants of the Assad regime. These were, on the whole, just uninvolved civilians, or even Alawite civilians who were known to oppose Assad's rule. That incident appears to have started when some militia elements from the former Assad regime ambushed a Syrian military force that was seeking to arrest some, let's say, senior officers from the former regime, but it very quickly descended into a wholesale massacre in which hundreds, and according to some reports, even more than 1,000 Alawite civilians were massacred, entire families in some cases, and so on. What happened here is a little unclear. According to some reports, a Syrian army patrol entered Lebanese territory, whether deliberately or inadvertently, is unclear. And in the ensuing firefight, 3 Syrian soldiers were killed. According to some reports, these were local Lebanese villagers or militias. According to others, it was Hezbollah. So I'm not entirely certain about the details of this incident. But regardless of fact and fiction, it's quite clear that there is a lot of residual friction, if I can call it that, between Syria's new rulers and Hezbollah, which, of course, for years fought in Lebanon on the side of the ousted Syrian government. And now, of course, many Syrians have also sought refuge in Lebanon. So there's a real, there's a real risk of violent escalation here. And once again, it's, I think, primarily the responsibility of the new Lebanese government, which is not dominated by Hezbollah, and which has indicated that it is seeking to assert Lebanese sovereignty over its borders and so on. It needs to do more, both in regard to relations with Syria to stabilize this volatile border region, and of course needs to be able to assert its authority over areas in southern Lebanon that are still occupied by Israel.
I'm sure we'll return to this story probably next week, possibly, depending on what's happening on the ground. I want to turn our attention to the US, where we are literally seeing the transformation of America into a form of a police state, especially if you see some of the decisions that are being taken by the White House, particularly in relation to Mahmoud Khalil, who was arrested. He holds a green card. He's married to an American citizen. So now the White House admits that Khalil hasn't broken any law, but according to Rubio, he is deemed a threat to U.S. foreign policy. It is a vague term, and therefore he possibly faces the chance of being thrown out. So there are, of course, other cases where Columbia University has been asked to adopt a number of policy changes if it wishes to restore the $400 million in federal funding, and these measures are extremely repressive, like adopting the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, and many other cases where pro-Palestinian speech will more or less be criminalized. So, I mean, the question, there are other examples we could cite, but I mean, do you see that this is another sign that America, when it comes to Palestinian issue at least, it's become a more and more police state? The First Amendment does not protect criticism of Israel and support for Palestine.
Yes, I mean, there's so many observations to be made about this case. The Trump administration came into office declaring war against DEI, diversity, equality, and inclusion initiatives, because these somehow unfairly privileged minorities who have been historically, enslaved and segregated and persecuted in the United States. But of course, an exception is made, and that exception is not for Jewish Americans, because the Jewish community in the United States is, of course, split. Pro-Israeli Americans are now a protected minority. I mean, your ability to support genocide is viewed as somehow under threat, and this is all being couched in terms of the campaign against anti-Semitism and all the rest of it. But not a finger has been lifted where pro-Palestinian Jewish Americans are under threat. I guess they're considered Hamas or non-Jews or whatever. The second point is that Columbia University has now spent over a year doing everything within its power to appease the U.S. government and U.S. Congress. This began already during the Biden administration. And of course, when you appease a bully, you invariably lose. And what was at stake here for Columbia University is $400 million. Now, that may be a huge amount to you and me, but for a university as well endowed as Columbia, $400 million actually isn't all that much, and they could have easily done without it. But they have essentially, thrown their own university under the bus, certainly thrown a good part of their student body and faculty under the bus, in their zeal to reclaim favorable status with the U.S. Government. And what has happened now is that the university has now expelled or suspended or even revoked the degrees of a number of current and former Columbia students, and yet a further attempt to appease the U.S. government. I mean, this is something right out of, an Orwell novel or a authoritarian handbook, and Columbia is wasting no effort to appease those who have more or less openly declared that they're on a mission to eliminate not only free speech, but academic freedom, who have, Vance has identified universities and professors as the enemy, and Columbia is going out of its way to appease him, as if these forces can be appeased. Now, the case of Mahmoud Khalil is particularly noteworthy for several reasons. First of all, he's not a foreign not a student foreign student on a student visa. He is a legal permanent resident of the United States. So in principle, he enjoys exactly the same rights to free speech, free assembly, protest, and all the rest of it as a U.S. Citizen. Second of all, he hasn't been accused of any crime, let alone convicted of one. And the law that is being invoked by Secretary of Repression, Marco Rubio, is Immigration and Naturalization Act, or something to that effect, a clause in it that allows the Secretary of State to determine that an individual should be stripped of their permanent residency and deported because they form a threat to the foreign policy of the United States. Now imagine, this kid, if I can call him that, who no one had ever heard of prior to last week, is now considered a threat to the ability of the most powerful nation in history to conduct its foreign policy. What is he accused of? He's accused of, as said by U.S. officials, activity aligned with Hamas. This conversation can be seen as activity aligned with Hamas. A cup of coffee can potentially be activity aligned with Hamas. It's absolutely meaningless drivel that is so hard to pin down that it gives the U.S. government very wide latitude to do what it wants. And the university has not even taken any measures against pro-Israeli students and faculty members at its own university who were actively inciting against Mahmoud Khalil and against others in the Colombia community in order to have them deported. It's absolutely incredible and incredibly shameful episode. And then last comment, of course, is yes, this is about Mahmoud Khalil. Yes, this is about pro-Palestinian speech. Yes, this is about a campaign to make any and all opposition to Israel an illegal and criminal offense. But as so often, using Palestinians as a, are Palestinians are being used as a battering ram, because if this succeeds, then any other legal permanent resident can also be stripped of their status and deported on equally flimsy charges. And a number of U.S. Civil rights specialists and attorneys have already said, once this precedent passes, the rights of U.S. citizens will be next on the chopping block. Wadia Saeed had an excellent article on this issue in Dissent magazine last week, which is, again, easily accessible online. But we should see this incident, if I can call it that, as reflecting both the foreign policy and domestic policy priorities of the Trump administration, or at least of powerful forces within the Trump administration.
Yeah, on your last point, I think it's worth pointing out that in the long term, there's a great danger this will have it'll be counterproductive. Why? Because if Americans who love America and American freedoms see their freedoms being curtailed by using anti-Semitism as a battering ram, guess who they will blame once their freedom has been curtailed? Their blame will be directed at the Jewish community, who have been asking or seeking protection and curtailing American freedoms. The first to be targeted will be Jews. So there will be genuine anti-Semitism as a result of this attempt to silence political speech. So I think that there's a short-sightedness in this, which does not address the real problem. And ultimately,
Sorry, please go ahead.
Yeah, ultimately, as you mentioned, there's a domestic element to this and the foreign policy element to this. And the domestic element is that Trump is really seeking to remake America as a state. And there are so many other governments, right-wing governments across Europe. And this is a global project in some sense, that they're trying to or seeking to recreate the state in a different form, in a more draconian form, more of a police state. That's what they're seeking, and they need a justification. And the justification they're giving is our society has been infiltrated by these terrorists, and therefore we need to become a police state in order to combat this rise of terrorism or within our midst. This is very dangerous, and ultimately it would feed into anti-Semitism and create more anti-Semitism and hatred towards Jews in the long run.
Yes, and particularly because you have organizations like it calls itself the Anti-Defamation League, which should properly be named the Defamation League, jumping on this bandwagon, promoting this campaign with all the resources at their disposal, and making all kinds of lurid and entirely unsubstantiated accusations about what Mahmoud Khalil actually is quote unquote guilty of. Well, if he had done any of this stuff that he's now accused of, how come he was never even charged, let alone put on trial or convicted of any of these activities? But that's one way of deflecting. And I think you're entirely right. These kinds of very dangerous tactics can very easily blow up and lead to an increase of genuine anti-Semitism, and that's a real risk here. The other risk, of course, is once this precedent goes through, who's next? Anyone who opposes tariffs against Canada and Mexico, for example, anyone who opposes U.S. policy in Ukraine or towards Europe. This really is a test case, and personally, I'm not very confident that the opposition is going to be able to roll it back.
Anyone who opposes Canada becoming the 51st state, who knows?
Yes.
But I want to get your thoughts on another story, which again I think highlights how this fight against anti-Semitism is collapsing on the weight of its own contradictions. And this is really a remarkable, extraordinary story where Germany's anti-Semitism czar cancelled his participation in the International Conference on Combating Anti-Semitism in Israel itself. Reason being, Israel has invited a number of far-right leaders for this conference. Leaders traditionally seen as being anti-Semitic. As a result, Germany's anti-Semitism czar, what is his name? Felix Klein. So he will not be attending, nor will French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy, a number of others. Who would have thought? I mean, this feels like Alice through the Looking Glass. An anti-Semitism conference organized by Israel invites known anti-Semites, which is being now boycotted by Germany's top anti-Semitism czar, along with many other influential European figures. And again, it goes to the point I was making earlier. It feels like the fight against anti-Semitism is collapsing on the weight of its own contradictions.
I mean, I feel like I hardly need to comment. You just need to listen to your introduction of this topic, and that kind of says it all. The only additional comment I would make is that this demonstrates that this is not only is this not about anti-Semitism, it has absolutely nothing to do with anti-Semitism. Anti-Semites are in fact welcome and valued guests at this conference. Why? Because it's about Israel and it's about Zionism. If you support Israel and you promote the genocide and you're an apologist for Israeli policy and you endorse Israeli apartheid, then we don't care what you think of Jews. You can be a Holocaust denier, you can be whatever you want. The only criteria here is your views of Israel and of its policies. If you're politically correct on that score, you can think whatever you want about Jews. That's what it's come to.
And let's end on another remarkable story from last week. Marco Rubio, he has made the South African ambassador to the US persona non grata. Is this, in your view, just another example of South Africa paying the price for its attempt to hold Israel to account for its genocide in Gaza at the International Court of Justice?
I think that's certainly a very significant element in this story. The other, of course, is that the second most powerful person in the U.S. government now, some would even argue the most powerful, is Elon Musk, birthed under apartheid and apparently very passionately invested in turning the clock back. He has persuaded President Trump to declare Afrikaners a persecuted minority and give them privileged access. They can basically now apply for political asylum in the U.S. because I guess in Musk's worldview, there was apartheid in South Africa, but it was against the white minority regime, not against the people of that country, the overwhelmingly African majority. So I think there's that element plays a significant role here as well. But quite clearly, we wouldn't be here without South Africa's bold and courageous and principled decision to bring this case against Israel to under the Genocide Convention before the International Court of Justice.
Thank you, Mouin. That was my guest, Mouin Rabbani, joining me, Nassim Ahmed, for our weekly review, rundown of the main stories from the Middle East this week. Looking forward to our discussion next week, Mouin.
Likewise. Thank you very much, Nassim.
And thank you for tuning in. See you next week. Bye-bye.